So what comes most to my heart is the principle of every child's potential, no losers. And the fact is, this is an ancient Confucian value. This is nothing new. And it's a value that's much more progressive than Plato. I studied Plato in my early years. I did classics at the University of Toronto. And Plato's notion of classes in society left a long tradition in the European system where only a few elite are believed to have full potential. And people are divided up by levels of intelligence. So here I've quoted also from our chair, the concept that everyone is educable, everyone can become a sage, forms a basic optimism and dynamism towards tradition in the Confucian tradition, towards education. This is something the world needs to learn more fully. And China has that principle, and Hong Kong has now truly put that into practice in the reforms. Now I want to go into my three kind of philosophical points, the second half of my paper. And it's quite difficult for me to discuss them in full, so I hope you'll read the paper. But first I want to reflect on the British tradition. What I feel would be very unfortunate is as Hong Kong has moved away from structures it inherited from Britain, that it should say, well, the British tradition is now not suitable for us. We're going to do the progressive thing and follow the Americans in the world. Actually, there are very precious heritages from Britain. Mainland China doesn't have them for historical reasons, but Hong Kong has them for 155 years. And a notion of education, not just as human capital. I really dislike that term, but it's being used by economists everywhere in terms of a competitive knowledge economy. Human resources is a bit broader, suggests broader dimensions of education. But I have a new concept for you, which I hope you will embrace. Humane talent. Not human talent, but humane talent. And here are two words from Chinese, which the Chinese speakers and readers recognize well. Lai, the notion of ceremony, politeness, and yen, the core concept of Confucianism, which is benevolence. And I find a wonderful parallel with English. So English, we take the word human, we add an E, humane, it means something completely different. China, you take the word for person, yen, you add two, it means something completely different. And I really believe this is so important. Ronald Dorr, the great British sinologist, wrote about the difference between education for productive self-fulfillment and creative activity as against acquisitive achievement. And human capital is encouraging acquisitive achievement, and we have to avoid that. And I found many phrases in Hong Kong documents that recognize the importance of this. So let me just quote from UGC. It would be a mistake to regard universities exclusively in terms of a direct utility to the Hong Kong economy. Students should acquire the moral and ethical tools to contribute to the world. So how can we bring about the forming of humane talent? Keep the British tradition. We have hundreds of Christian schools, Catholic and Protestant, as well as schools affiliated with other religions here in Hong Kong, which are such a treasure house for bringing about these humane aspects and spiritual aspects of education at this time. Now let me go to another term, inclusive individuality. One of the problems of Asian people following American progressivism is that the whole notion of the individual in American and North American society is different than in Asia. It's the rights-bearing individual demanding their rights that is at the root of our ideas of individualism in many ways, protected by law. But in Chinese society, the individual is a social being. The individual cannot be separated from the family and the community that they are embedded within. And so we need a concept of individualism that comes out of Chinese philosophy. And I have found one for you, inclusive individualism. I think it's a very lovely idea, the idea of the inclusive individual. And I'm presenting to you here a set of thinking coming out of the Ming Neo-Confucian tradition. I think many of you are familiar with the great scholar Wang Yangming of the 14th and 15th century in China, who developed the learning of the heart, samhak, and the notion of hangji, knowledge through action. He threw away the books. He went to a quiet place and he said, we have to reflect on what we learned from action, and we have to develop a deep self in which our knowing is rooted. So this is a very powerful potential for American progressivism, which has many positive features, to be adapted to and integrated into the Chinese tradition, particularly that of Ming Neo-Confucianism. And the great scholar of the last century was Liang Shuming, who really wrote extensively on this kind of thinking. So I hope that can be a resource, a spiritual resource, an epistemological, a cultural resource for Hong Kong. And finally, creativity. Everyone loves to talk about creativity. And I think, in a way, China's ancient philosopher, Zhuangzi, Lao Tzu, of course, is very famous for the Tao Te Ching, but Zhuangzi was an even more radical Taoist philosopher. And Confucian scholarship really retained its value because it was always open. It was always challenged by the opposite, and the opposite was Taoism. And in Taoism, there is a radical freedom. There were some years in my life when every year I took time to read the Zhuangzi once. It's a classical text from the 3rd century BC, because it is so, how can I say, liberating. Liberating from all social constraints, all natural constraints, to think creatively in the freest possible way. A remarkable Chinese dynamic that rejects and yet embraces individual needs and experiences has helped preserve and nourish individualistic sentiments and make individual flourishing possible. So we need to find a root of creativity in China's own philosophical traditions and then offer that to the world, see where it connects to the ideas of creativity in the Western world, in other parts of Asia, and other parts of the world. So I see that as a new concept of humanity that centers on social harmony and also nurtures individual flourishing. This is a word from Tu Weiming, the great Harvard Confucian scholar, and I like it very much. Individual flourishing and self-realization. So I'm going to close my talk here. I think I've stayed within my half hour by saying I think Hong Kong is uniquely positioned to move the global dialogue on education beyond the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a great period of liberation, creativity, new thinking, science, and its ideas have really shaped the education discourse globally for a very long time. I think we have to affirm it, appreciate it, but not stop with the Enlightenment. And this phrase comes from Tu Weiming, the Harvard scholar. He is now in Beijing University, actually, and has written extensively about Confucianism as a world heritage, not an East Asian local ethnic tradition, but a philosophical tradition and set of ideas that belong to the world. I believe Hong Kong, even a little bit more than mainland China, although mainland China is moving so quickly, mainland China has so many different things to take care of at the moment. I'm challenging them. You have to bring your education to the world now. The world sees your economy, but where are your educational theories and ideas and concepts? I think Hong Kong can really connect to China and take leadership because it's been a cosmopolitan city for such a long time and has been connected to the world. And so I end with a comment on the spiritual. I was very, very touched that many of the documents mention not only moral, aesthetic education, but also spiritual, the spiritual element in education. And I think that is very important. And here we can come to the beautiful Chinese concept of Tin, heaven. Heaven, expressing an order that is both divine and natural, both social and cosmic. Historically, this concept was used by the Jesuits when they came to China 500 years ago as a frame to bring Christianity, its values, its teaching, its truths into the Chinese universe. It's really a very beautiful, expansive concept that we can reflect upon. And it made possible the absorption of Western learning into a Chinese universe. That's the challenge that faces us. It has many dimensions. It has the scientific, it has the moral, it has the aesthetic, and it also has the spiritual. Just one last comment here. We have been so ingrained with the 19th century European experience, particularly in international relations. So we know that in fields of, it's a field I've worked on particularly because of my work on universities in the international arena. Realism is still the dominant tradition. And realism means I separate my country from yours and I think about what is going to benefit my country. How can I prevent invasions? How can I promote? This is what embassies do. I worked in an embassy, so I know exactly how it works. So there tends to be that self and other as two separate entities, which must be kept separate, particularly in the international diplomatic regime. But China has a broader notion, a broader of diatone, great harmony, the great harmony. Nurturing a self that is both related and separate. This is what we can do with this notion of the inclusive individual. So I'll leave those thoughts with you. I thank you again for the very great honor of being with you today, and I hope you will take time to read the paper when you have the opportunity. Thank you.